The first time I made the payment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. A father helping his child. No different from teaching him to ride a bike or checking the closet for monsters, just scaled up to adult proportions. David and Emma had been married for only 6 months. Their faces still glowing with newlywed optimism despite the harsh realities of entry-level salaries in an unforgiving city. I still remember David's voice on the phone that Sunday, strained with an attempt at casual conversation that couldn't quite mask his underlying anxiety. "We're fine, Dad. Just figuring things out," he'd said when I asked how they were settling into their new apartment. The place is great, really great location. But I'd raised this boy for 28 years before Emma had joined our family. I knew the subtle pitch changes in his voice, could read the spaces between his words as clearly as if they'd been printed in bold type. David wasn't fine. They weren't fine. I'd driven to their apartment the next day, unannounced, with the excuse of dropping off a tool set they might need. Their building was in a neighborhood that made me think twice about leaving my car parked on the street. The security door propped open with a brick, graffiti decorating the stairwell. The apartment itself was tiny, oppressively so, with water stains blooming across one ceiling and a persistent smell of someone else's cooking embedded in the walls. Emma had welcomed me with genuine warmth, her teacher salary having paid for modest but thoughtful touches that tried to transform the space. Cheerful curtains, framed photographs, a bookshelf David had assembled from a kit. My son had given me the tour with forced pride, pointing out the excellent closet space, barely enough for their combined wardrobes, and the tons of natural light from a single window overlooking an alley. It was when Emma went to make coffee that David confided in me. His voice dropped to a whisper. "The rent's killing us, Dad. But Emma loves being close to her school, and all the decent places further out would mean a horrible commute for her." "How much is it?" I'd asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. When he told me the figure, nearly 70% of their combined take-home pay, I had to work to keep my expression from revealing my alarm. No wonder they looked tired. No wonder the refrigerator I'd peeked into held little more than condiments and a half-empty carton of eggs. They were drowning, and too proud to ask for the life preserver I was more than capable of throwing. I made the decision before I even left their apartment. Not a loan that would wound David's pride, not a direct contribution that would make them feel like charity cases, but something subtle, something invisible, a father's protection, wrapped in a disguise that would allow them to maintain the illusion of independence. The property management company had been surprisingly accommodating once I'd explained the situation and offered a sizable administrative fee for their discretion. A simple arrangement. I would pay the majority of their rent directly. They would adjust what they billed to David and Emma, and my name would appear nowhere on any documentation my son or his wife might see. "We do this more often than you'd think," the property manager had confided with a knowing smile, "especially with young couples in this market. Parents, grandparents, sometimes it's the only way they can afford to live in the city." That first month, when David called to excitedly tell me about the computer error that had dramatically reduced their rent bill. "They say it's a system glitch they can't fix until the lease renewal. Dad, can you believe our luck?" I felt only the warm glow of having eased my child's burden. The deception seemed a small price to pay for the relief in his voice, for knowing they could now afford groceries and perhaps even save a little toward their future. "That's wonderful, son," I'd replied, the lie sitting surprisingly easy on my tongue. Sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you need. In truth, the universe had nothing to do with it. Just a father who had postponed his own retirement plans to ensure his son and daughter-in-law could have a roof over their heads without the shame of admitting they couldn't afford on their own. That had been 2 years ago. 24 payments, each one accompanied by a detailed statement from the management company that I carefully destroyed. 24 months of watching David and Emma gradually relax into what they believed was financial stability earned through their own efforts. I told myself it was temporary, just until David's career in architectural design took off, just until Emma moved up from first-year teacher to something with better compensation, just until they found their footing in the adult world I had tried so hard to prepare them for. But as months became years, the temporary solution calcified into permanent arrangement, and my silence about it grew more difficult to break. How could I tell them after 6 months that their financial independence was an illusion? After a year? After 2, the longer I waited, the more impossible the revelation became. Instead, I channeled my paternal concern into other avenues. Weekly calls to check in, gentle suggestions about safer neighborhoods they might consider when their lease ended, questions about their future plans, when they might start a family, whether they were saving adequately for a home of their own someday. All the things a father naturally worries about, all the wisdom I want to share before it was too late to benefit them. I didn't realize how these well-intentioned inquiries were being received. Didn't see that my persistent interest in their finances might seem intrusive rather than supportive. Didn't understand that my suggestions about different apartments might appear critical of their choices rather than concern for their safety. Didn't recognize that my questions about grandchildren might feel like pressure on a couple already struggling with the economics of their current situation. The signs were there, if I'd been willing to see them. Emma's increasingly polite, but brief responses when I called. David changing the subject whenever I brought up their living situation. The growing tension in their voices when I visited. A subtle defensiveness in how they described their decisions. But I attributed it all to the normal friction of young adults establishing boundaries, never to the fundamental deception that underlay our relationship. Even when David began declining my offers to help with projects around their apartment, when Emma stopped asking for my advice about their budget, when their invitations for me to visit became less frequent, I didn't connect it to my secret support. I was helping them. How could help possibly be the problem? The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon in April, during what was supposed to be a casual visit to see their new furniture, a matching set of end tables they found at a vintage store and refinished together. I brought lunch, some deli sandwiches from the place David had loved since childhood, along with a 6-pack of the craft beer he preferred, small offerings of fatherly care that seemed harmless enough. We had a pleasant meal, with David proudly showing me photos of a small project he'd been assigned at work, his first real chance to demonstrate his design skills beyond the administrative tasks that had occupied most of his first 2 years at the firm. Emma had shared amusing stories about her second graders, her face animated as she described their class garden project. It was afterward, as we settled in the living room with beers, that I made what I thought was an innocent comment. "This neighborhood still makes me nervous, David. Jack's son just moved into a decent building in Westridge, much safer area, and I hear the rent is actually quite reasonable for what you get." I didn't miss the look that passed between them, a loaded glance that carried the weight of many previous discussions. Emma's posture stiffened slightly, her smile becoming fixed. "We're happy here, Robert," she said, her tone deliberately light. "The neighborhood is actually improving a lot. They're opening a new community garden on the corner, and there's talk of a coffee shop going in downstairs." Still, I persisted, "With all the money you must be saving with that rent glitch, you could probably afford something in a better area, especially if you're thinking about starting a family soon." Another look between them, this one impossible to misinterpret. David set his beard down with deliberate care. "Dad, we've talked about this. We're not ready for kids yet, and we like this apartment. I'm just saying, with a baby you might want more space, and better schools nearby. Have you looked into what district you're zoned for here? Because I did some research, and—" "We don't need you to research schools for us," David interrupted, an edge entering his voice that I rarely heard directed at me. "We're years away from having to think about that. I should have backed off then. Should have recognized the warning signs, the rising tension in the room. But at 60 years old, after decades of guiding my son through life's obstacles, it was hard to simply watch them make what seemed like short-sighted decisions when I had the experience and the financial means to help. You know, when your mother and I were your age, we were already thinking about school districts, planning ahead. That's how we were able to get you into Lakeside Elementary, which set you up for—" "Dad." David's voice was sharper now. "We're not you and Mom. We're doing things our way, on our timeline. I understand that, son. I just want to make sure you're thinking about these things. Financial planning takes time. If you let me look over your budget, maybe I could suggest—" "Our budget is fine," Emma interjected with forced brightness. "We've actually managed to start saving a little each month since the rent reduction. Dave has been tracking everything on a spreadsheet." Pride swelled in me momentarily. My son, being responsible with the breathing room I'd secretly provided, before I registered the defensiveness beneath her words. They thought they were succeeding on their own, building something together without help. My deception, meant to ease their burden, had inadvertently created a false narrative they were now invested in protecting. That's great, I said, trying to recalibrate. Really great. I'm proud of you both. I just worry, That's what fathers do. Well, you don't need to, David said, standing up abruptly. We're adults. We're handling things. The conversation moved on to safer topics after that. A baseball game, Emma's brother's new job, a movie they'd recently seen. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a current of tension that hadn't been there before. When I left an hour later, David's hug was stiff, perfunctory, and Emma's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Driving home to my empty house, the house where I'd raised David after his mother died, the house that now felt too large and too quiet, I replayed the interaction, trying to pinpoint where I'd gone wrong. Was it the suggestion about moving? The mention of children? The offer to review their finances? Or was it something deeper? The fundamental disconnect between my perception of myself as a supportive father and their experience of me as the intrusive parent who couldn't let them grow up? The gap between my intention to help and my impact to undermine? What I didn't question, not then, was the wisdom of continuing the secret rent payments. That still seemed like pure generosity, a silent gift with no strings attached. If anything, I told myself they needed that support more than ever if they were truly planning to start saving seriously for their future. It never occurred to me that my financial assistance and my perceived interference might be two sides of the same coin, both stemming from my inability to trust them to make their own way in the world without my intervention, both reflecting my fear of becoming irrelevant in my son's life as he built his own family, both in their different ways, preventing David and Emma from experiencing the true consequences of their adult choices. That night, I wrote the check for the next month's rent contribution, a ritual that had become automatic over the past 2 years. As I sealed the envelope, I felt the familiar satisfaction of knowing I was making their lives easier, protecting them from hardship they didn't even know existed. A father's love, expressed through financial sacrifice they would never have to acknowledge or thank me for. I could never have imagined that the secret support, this invisible safety net I constructed beneath their lives, would soon become the very thing that threatened to sever my relationship with my son entirely. The subtle shift in David and Emma's behavior toward me became impossible to ignore in the months following our tense conversation. Where once our Sunday phone calls had been a reliable ritual, now they increasingly went to voicemail. Invitations to their apartment dwindled from weekly to monthly to when things settled down. Even text messages, once responded to immediately, now linger for hours or days before receiving brief replies. I told myself they were just busy. David had mentioned a demanding new project at work. Emma was taking graduate courses in the evenings for her master's degree. Young couples needed space to build their lives together, without a father hovering at the edges. This was natural, healthy, even a sign that they were establishing their own family unit. But as May turned to June and summer settled over the city, the distance between us grew until it became a presence of its own, a fourth entity joining our small family constellation. I found myself analyzing every interaction for clues about what had changed, what I had done to cause this cooling of our relationship. Had I been too pushy about the apartment? Too obvious in my disapproval of their neighborhood? Too persistent with my questions about their financial planning? In my darker moments, I wonder if they had somehow discovered my secret arrangement with the property management company, if my deception had been exposed. But no, that was impossible. I had been meticulously careful, paying in person with checks from an account David knew nothing about, ensuring all documentation stayed with the management company or was destroyed. They couldn't know. This had to be about something else. One Tuesday evening in July, I decided to bridge the growing gap with a peace offering. David had always loved my grilled steaks and twice-baked potatoes, comfort food from his childhood that represented home and security. I texted him that morning, "Firing up the grill tonight. Ribeyes and those potatoes you like. Dinner at 7? His response came hours later, brief but encouraging. "Sounds great. We'll bring wine." I spent the afternoon preparing with perhaps excessive care, marinating the steaks, selecting the largest russet potatoes, making the salad with the champagne vinaigrette Emma had once complimented. I even pulled out the good dishes, the ones that had belonged to David's mother, only used for special occasions since her passing 15 years earlier. They arrived 20 minutes late, David apologetic about traffic, Emma carrying a decent bottle of Cabernet. Something about their demeanor struck me immediately. A wariness, a careful politeness that hadn't been necessary between us before. They moved around my kitchen with the awkward formality of guests rather than family, making small talk about the weather, the garden, the new restaurant down the street. Dinner began pleasantly enough, the familiar food creating a temporary bridge back to easier times. David relaxed visibly as he ate, complimenting the steaks, reminiscing about summer barbecues from his teenage years. For a brief window, it felt like we had recaptured our old dynamic. The closeness that had defined our relationship since his mother's death had made us a team of two against the world. So, how are things at the apartment? I asked as we moved from dinner to dessert. Apple crisp with vanilla ice cream, another childhood favorite. Still having good luck with that rent situation? The question seemed innocent enough to me, a natural inquiry about their living situation. But something in David's expression shuddered immediately, the momentary openness replaced by that now familiar guardedness. "It's fine," he said shortly. "Everything's fine. I'm just asking, son. No need to get defensive." "I'm not defensive," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I just don't see why we need to talk about our finances every time we see you." Emma placed a gentle hand on his arm, a subtle gesture of either restraint or support. I couldn't tell which. "What David means is that we're managing well, Robert. The apartment is working out great for us." "I'm glad to hear it," I said, trying to navigate back to safer conversational waters. "And how about that project at work, David? The mixed-use development you were telling me about?" He relaxed slightly, launching into a description of his design contributions to a new urban renewal project. I listened attentively, asking questions that demonstrated my interest and pride in his professional growth. This was comfortable territory for us, the father-son dynamic we perfected over decades. Me, the encouraging mentor; he, the ambitious son seeking approval for his achievements. The evening might have ended on this positive note, if not for an innocent comment from Emma as we cleared the dessert plates. "We're actually thinking of taking a vacation in August," she mentioned, carrying dishes to the sink. "Just a week in Maine, nothing extravagant, but we've been saving up and I think we can finally swing it." "Maine!" I echoed, mentally calculating the costs, flights, accommodations, meals, car rental. "That's quite an expense for a week." David's shoulders tensed visibly. "We can afford it, Dad." "I'm sure you can." I backpedaled, recognizing the warning signs. "I just meant it's good that you've been able to save enough. That's impressive on your salaries." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a critical error. The implication that their incomes were insufficient, that their ability to save was somehow surprising, hung in the air between us. "What's that supposed to mean?" David asked, his voice deceptively quiet. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just that I'm proud of you for being responsible with your money." "Our salaries are perfectly adequate," Emma interjected, a rare edge entering her normally diplomatic tone. "We're doing quite well, actually." "Of course you are," I agreed, desperately trying to extract myself from the conversational quicksand. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. "Didn't you?" David set down the plate he was holding with deliberate care. "Because it sounds like you still think we can't manage without your advice. Like we're still children playing house, instead of adults with careers and a marriage." "That's not what I think at all," I protested, though a small voice in my head whispered that perhaps there was some truth to his accusation. Didn't my secret rent payments prove that I didn't fully trust them to manage on their own? "I'm just interested in your lives. That's what fathers do." "There's interested, and then there's whatever this is," David replied, gesturing vaguely. "This constant implication that we don't know what we're doing, that we need your guidance about everything from our apartment to our finances to when we should have children." "David," Emma murmured, a note of caution in her voice. Let's not do this now. But something had broken open between us, some dam of restraint that had been holding back months of accumulated tension. David turned to face me fully, his expression a mixture of frustration and determination. "Do you know how it feels," he asked quietly, "to have every decision we make as a couple subtly questioned? To have every accomplishment undermined by the suggestion that we couldn't possibly have achieved it without help? To feel like I'm constantly being measured against some standard of adulthood I can never quite reach in your eyes." The raw hurt in his voice stunned me. This wasn't just irritation at an over-involved parent. This was deep-seated pain, a fundamental disconnect between how I saw our relationship and how he experienced it. "I've never meant to make you feel that way," I said, and it was the absolute truth. "I'm proud of you, David. So proud of the man you become, the life you're building with Emma. If I've been too involved, it's only because I care." "Caring isn't the issue," he replied, some of the anger draining from his voice, replaced by a weariness that seemed too old for his 32 years. "It's the way you care. Like you don't trust us to handle our own lives. Like you're still waiting in the wings to catch us when we inevitably fail." Emma stepped closer to him, their shoulders touching in a silent display of unity that suddenly made me feel like the outsider I perhaps have been all along. "We appreciate everything you've done for us," she said gently, "but we need room to make our own choices, our own mistakes, even. That's the only way we'll grow as a couple." "I understand," I said, though in truth, I wasn't sure I did. How could caring too much be a problem? How could offering guidance based on decades more life experience be interpreted as lack of faith in their abilities? I'll try to step back a bit. The remainder of the evening passed in strained politeness. The earlier warmth completely evaporated. When they left shortly after 9, claiming early meetings the next day, David's goodbye hug was brief and perfunctory. As I watched their car pull away from the curb, I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a sense of loss I couldn't quite articulate. Back in my empty kitchen, cleaning up the remains of the dinner I had prepared with such hopeful anticipation, I replayed our conversation, trying to understand where I had gone wrong. Was I truly as intrusive as David perceived me to be? Were my attempts to help actually hindering their growth as a couple? And if so, what did that mean for the secret financial support I continue to provide? The monthly rent check sat on my desk, already addressed and stamped, ready to be mailed the next day. Looking at it now, I began to see it differently, not as a selfless act of paternal love I had always considered it, but as something more complicated, a double-edged gesture that both helped and harmed them, that solved immediate financial problems while creating deeper relational ones. By removing the natural consequences of their choice to live in an apartment beyond their means, was I preventing them from developing the financial resilience they would need throughout their adult lives? By maintaining the fiction that they were succeeding independently, was I actually undermining their ability to accurately assess their situation and make informed decisions about their future? Most troublingly, wasn't there something fundamentally dishonest about presenting myself as merely an interested father while secretly acting as their financial safety net? Didn't this arrangement, well-intentioned though it was, represent exactly the kind of lack of trust in their capabilities that David had just accused me of? I sealed the envelope containing the check with a sense of unease I hadn't experienced in the previous 24 months of payments. What had begun as a simple act of fatherly protection had evolved into something more complex and potentially harmful, a secret intervention that reflected my own inability to let go more than their need for support. But I mailed the check anyway, because stopping now, without explanation, would mean they would suddenly face the full financial burden of their rent. A shock that could destabilize the very marriage I was apparently ruining through my involvement. Because breaking my silence about the arrangement would mean admitting to a 2-year deception that might permanently damage David's trust in me. Because if I was brutally honest with myself, I wasn't ready to relinquish this last tangible connection to my son's daily life, this final way of maturing in his world. As July turned to August, our interactions grew increasingly infrequent and formal. David called dutifully once a week, but our conversations remained superficial, whether sports, innocuous work anecdotes that revealed nothing of substance about his life. Emma, once warm and communicative, now limited her interactions with me to brief greetings when David called and generic birthday and holiday cards signed with both their names. They did take their vacation to Maine, sending me a few obligatory photos of lighthouses and lobster dinners. I responded with appropriate enthusiasm while silently calculating how much of their savings for this trip had actually been made possible by my undisclosed financial support. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable, knowing they believed they were succeeding independently while I continued to artificially reduce their financial burden. Hearing David accuse me of not trusting them to manage their own lives while secretly proving his point each month with my rent checks, wanting them to develop financial responsibility while shielding them from the real cost of their choices. Something would have to change. I just didn't expect the catalyst to come from such an unexpected direction, or for the reckoning to arrive with such sudden, devastating clarity. September arrived with unseasonable heat and the kind of sticky humidity that made the city feel like it was holding its breath. I was doing yard work on a Saturday morning when my phone rang, David's name appearing on the screen, a rare weekend call that immediately set off warning bells in my mind. "Dad." His voice sounded strained, tightly controlled in a way that suggested he was working hard to maintain composure. "We need to talk. In person. Can you come to our place this afternoon?" "Of course," I replied, alarm rising at his unusual formality. "Is everything all right? Are you and Emma—" 3:00, he interrupted. "Please don't be late." The call ended abruptly, leaving me standing in my half-mowed lawn, sweat cooling unpleasantly on my skin as a knot of apprehension formed in my stomach. Something was wrong, seriously wrong, and my mind raced through possibilities. Marriage troubles? Health issues? Job loss? I showered and changed, then spent the next few hours in a state of growing anxiety, checking the time every few minutes as if that might somehow accelerate its passage. By 2:30, I could wait no longer and headed to their apartment, arriving 20 minutes early, but waiting in my car until exactly 3 before approaching their building. Emma opened the door at my knock, her expression unreadable, but her usual warm greeting notably absent. "Robert, come in." David's in the living room. The apartment felt different somehow, tense, airless, as if the walls themselves were holding something back. David sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa, a manila folder on the coffee table before him. He didn't rise when I entered, didn't offer the customary hug or handshake, just gestured toward the armchair across from him. "Sit down, Dad." I complied, looking between them with mounting concern. Emma remained standing, slightly behind David's position on the sofa, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. "What's going on?" I asked, unable to bear the suspense any longer. "Is someone ill? Did something happen?" David reached for the folder, opening it with deliberate slowness. "Our lease renewal came up. We had a meeting with the property manager yesterday to sign the new agreement." The significance of this statement wasn't immediately clear to me, though a vague uneasiness began to creep up my spine. "Oh, and how much are they raising the rent? These management companies get greedier every year." David's eyes met mine, hard and direct, in a way I'd rarely seen. "That's an interesting question, Dad, because according to Mr. Phillips, our rent hasn't actually been what we thought it was for the past 2 years. The world seemed to slow around me, sound fading as if I were suddenly underwater. I knew with cold certainty what was in that folder, what conversation had taken place with the property manager, what secret had been exposed. Still, I heard myself asking, "What do you mean?" "Don't." David's voice cracked slightly, the first hint of the emotion churning beneath his controlled exterior. "Don't pretend you don't know exactly what I'm talking about." He withdrew a sheet of paper from the folder and slid it across the coffee table toward me. It was a payment record, a comprehensive statement of the actual rent for their apartment, the portion billed to David and Emma, and a larger portion paid directly by me for the past 24 months. Mr. Phillips was very apologetic. David continued, his tone flat, said there had been a personnel change in the office, and the new billing clerk noticed a discrepancy. He assumed we knew about the arrangement, that we were all just being discreet about it. I stared at the paper, at the neat columns of figures that laid bare my deception. There was no point in denial, no plausible explanation I could offer that wouldn't compound the lie. I was trying to help. I said finally, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Help, David repeated incredulously. By lying to us for 2 years? By letting us believe we were managing on our own when actually you were secretly paying most of our rent? You were struggling. I tried to explain the reasons that seemed so clear, so justified, now sounding hollow even to me. That first time I visited, I could see how the rent was crushing you. You couldn't afford groceries, David. You were exhausted. I just wanted to ease the burden, without wounding your pride. My pride. The words exploded from him, the careful control finally shattering. This isn't about my pride. It's about trust, about honesty, about respecting us as adults capable of making our own decisions. Emma moved to sit beside him now, placing a steadying hand on his arm. Her face, usually so gentle, held a deep disappointment that cut me more sharply than David's anger. We've been making financial decisions based on false information, she said quietly, planning our future, our savings, our career paths, all while living in an economic fantasy you created for us. The implications of this struck me with fresh force. They hadn't just been enjoying a lower rent payment. They had been building their entire financial understanding on a fundamentally flawed premise. Every budget they created, every decision about what they could afford, every plan for their future had been based on numbers that weren't real. I never thought of it that way. I admitted I just saw that you were drowning, and I had the means to help. But you didn't help us learn to swim, David countered, leaning forward intently. You just secretly held our heads above water while letting us believe we were doing it ourselves. The metaphor landed with painful accuracy. Wasn't that exactly what I had done? Created the illusion of independence while actually fostering dependence? If you had just offered help openly, Emma added, we could have discussed it. Maybe accepted a smaller contribution that we knew about, or a short-term loan while we looked for a more affordable place. Or maybe we would have said no. David interjected firmly. Maybe we would have decided to move somewhere cheaper, or I would have picked up freelance work, or Emma would have tutored on weekends. The point is, it would have been our decision to make. The weight of their words pressed down on me, making it difficult to breathe in the close air of the apartment. They were right, of course. What I had framed to myself as generosity had actually been a profound act of disrespect. A statement that I didn't trust them to handle their own challenges, that I knew better than they did what was best of their lives. I'm sorry, I said, the inadequacy of the words painful in my throat. I thought I was protecting you. From what? David demanded. From reality? From consequences? From having to make tough choices like every other couple our age? What exactly were you protecting us from, Dad? The question penetrated to the heart of motivations I had never fully examined. What had I been trying to protect them from? The obvious answer, financial hardship, suddenly seemed like only the surface layer of a much deeper truth. From failing, I suppose, I admitted slowly, the realization forming as I spoke. From struggling the way your mother and I did when we were starting out. From having to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries that month. From not needing me anymore. The last words emerged almost involuntarily, exposing a vulnerability I hadn't intended to reveal. David's expression shifted slightly, anger giving way momentarily to something more complex. Did it ever occur to you, he asked, his voice softer now but no less intense, that struggling together, figuring things out as a couple, might actually have strengthened our marriage? That facing challenges might have helped us grow? It hadn't. Not once in 2 years had I considered that the financial pressure I was so eager to alleviate might actually have been a necessary forge to their relationship, a shared adversity that could have bonded them more deeply as they overcame it together. Or that we might have valued your honest advice and experience, Emma added, if it had been offered with respect for our agency rather than through manipulation. Another truth I had failed to recognize, that genuine guidance freely chosen might have been more valuable to them than covert intervention, that I might still have had an important role to play in their lives if I had trusted them enough to let them decide what that role should be. What happens now? I asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate financial situation. What happened to our relationship? to the trust one had betrayed, to the future I had always imagined where I remained a vital, necessary presence in my son's life. David and Emma exchanged a glance, a silent communication that underscored my outsider status. It was Emma who answered, her teacher's instinct for clear expectations evident in her response. Financially, we've asked Mr. Phillips to correct the billing immediately. From now on, we'll pay the full rent ourselves. But that's nearly 70% of your... I began automatically, then stopped at David's warning look. I understand. It's your decision. Yes, he said pointedly. It is. We'll need to make some adjustments. Emma's picking up Saturday tutoring sessions, and I'm taking on some freelance design work. We might need to consider moving when the lease ends if we can't sustain it. The practical, responsible approach they outlined should have reassured me. But all I could think about was the sudden strain they would face, the belt tightening that would replace the comfortable margin my payments had provided. I could still help, I offered, unable to completely surrender the role I had carved out for myself. Not secretly, but openly, a contribution you know about and can plan around. No, David's response was immediate and firm. That's not what this is about. We don't want your money. We want... He trailed off, seemingly unable to articulate exactly what they did want from me. In the silence that followed, the full measure of what my deception had cost became clear. Not just their trust, not just their goodwill, but something more fundamental. Their perception of me as a person of integrity, as someone whose love came without hidden agendas or manipulative control. I think what David is trying to say, Emma offered gently, is that we need some space to process this, to figure out what our relationship looks like going forward, on honest terms. Space. The word landed like a physical blow. They wanted distance from me, the exact opposite of what I had hoped to secure through my financial support. I understand, I said, though my chest felt hollow with loss. For what it's worth, I truly am sorry. I never meant to hurt either of you. Just the opposite. We know that, Emma acknowledged, her natural kindness asserting itself despite the circumstances. Your intentions weren't malicious. But the impact was that you undermined our marriage, David finished bluntly. Every time you questioned our decisions, suggested we couldn't manage on our own, treated us like children playing house. You were eroding our confidence in ourselves and each other. And all the while, you were secretly proving your own point by subsidizing our lifestyle. Stop ruining my marriage. His earlier accusation now made perfect, painful sense. What I had seen as loving involvement, they had experienced as destabilizing interference. What I had framed as generous support, they had discovered was manipulative control. I'll give you the space you need, I promised, rising from the chair on legs that felt unsteady beneath me, however long it takes. But please know that if you're ready to rebuild our relationship, I'll be here. No secrets, no hidden support, no try and protect you from your own lives. David nodded stiffly but didn't rise or offer the customary goodbye hug. Emma walked me to the door, her expression softened by compassion despite her evident disappointment in my actions. He needs time, she said quietly as we reached the threshold. We both do, but he loves you, Robert. That hasn't changed. Thank you for that, I replied, the small mercy of her words a lifeline I clung to desperately. Take care of each other. Walking to my car, I felt every one of my 60 years weighing on my shoulders. The bright September afternoon seemed mockingly at odds with the darkness that had descended on my world. I had lost something precious today. My son's trust, my place in his life, the relationship I had assumed would sustain me through my remaining years. And I had no one to blame but myself. As I drove home to my empty house, I confronted the bitter irony at the heart of my actions. In trying to prevent my son from failing, I had failed him profoundly myself. In attempting to remain necessary in his life, I had made myself someone he needed space from. In seeking to protect his marriage from financial strain, I had become the very thing threatening its foundation. The painful truth was that my secret support had never really been about helping David and Emma. It had been about helping myself, maintaining my role, preserving my importance, assuaging my fears of becoming irrelevant in my son's adult life. And in my self-focused blindness, I had damaged the very relationship I had been so desperate to preserve. The question now was whether that damage could ever be repaired, and what kind of father I would need to become to earn back the trust one had so carelessly thrown away. October brought a silence more profound than any I had experienced since Catherine's death 15 years earlier. No calls from David. No text messages. No response to the single voicemail I left expressing again how deeply sorry I was. Even the superficial updates about work and weekend plans that had characterized our recent interactions evaporated completely, leaving a void that echoed through my daily routine like footsteps in an empty house. I honored their request for space with a discipline that felt like constant self-denial. Every morning I picked up my phone to text David, only to set it down again untouched. Every Sunday, when our weekly calls had once been tradition, I found pointless tasks to occupy my hands and mind during that hour. Every time I drove past their neighborhood, which I now avoided when possible, I gripped the steering wheel tighter to prevent myself from making an impulsive visit with some manufactured excuse. In this enforced silence, I had no choice but to reflect on the patterns that had led to this rupture. Hours alone with my thoughts stripped away the comfortable justifications I had built around my actions, revealing motivations more complex and less noble than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. The first revelation came on a Tuesday evening in mid-October, as I sorted through old photographs in a half-hearted attempt to organize decades of memories. A picture from David's college graduation surfaced, him in his cap and gown, me standing proudly beside him, my hand gripping his shoulder perhaps a bit too firmly. In that moment of celebration, I had been genuinely, unabashedly proud of his achievement. But examining the image now, I recognized something else in my expression, something I had never admitted even to myself. Fear. Fear that this milestone marked the beginning of his true independence. Fear that his entry into adulthood would render me increasingly peripheral to his life. Fear, ultimately, of losing my primary identity as David's father and having to face who I was without that defining role. Wasn't that same fear at the heart of my secret financial support? Not just generosity or protection, but a desperate attempt to remain essential to his existence, to create a dependency he didn't know existed, but that satisfied my need to be needed? The second revelation came during a conversation with Jack, my oldest friend, over beers in his garage workshop. I hadn't intended to discuss the situation with David, had been too ashamed, honestly, to admit what I'd done, but 2 beers and Jack's direct questioning about why I seemed like hell warmed over broke through my reticence. "You did what?" Jack asked incredulously when I finally explained the situation. "Paid their rent behind their backs for 2 years? Jesus, Rob." "I was trying to help," I said defensively, the explanation sounding hollow even to my own ears after so many repetitions. Jack set down his beer and gave me a look I recognized from 40 years of friendship, the one that said he was about to deliver an uncomfortable truth. "Did Catherine ever tell you that you have a control problem?" he asked bluntly. The question caught me off guard. "What? No, I'm not controlling. I'm supportive." Jack's laugh held no humor. "Rob, I love you like a brother, but that's bullshit and you know it. You micromanage that boy's entire life. Sports, college applications, career choices. You had your hands in all of it. Catherine used to say you treated parenting like one of your engineering projects, always trying to optimize outcomes." The assessment stung precisely because it contained an uncomfortable kernel of truth. Catherine had indeed sometimes accused me of being overly directed with David, of having difficulty allowing him to find his own path through trial and error. I had always dismissed her concerns as exaggerated, had framed my intensive involvement as necessary guidance rather than problematic control. "She worried about it, you know," Jack continued, his tone gentler now. "Worried about what would happen when David was grown, and you couldn't direct his life anymore. She used to say you needed hobbies that had nothing to do with being a father." I stare at my beer, memories of conversations with Catherine flooding back, her gentle suggestions that I give David more space, her efforts to develop interests separate from parenthood, her occasional frustration with what she called my helicopter approach long before that term became common. She was right. I admitted the words painful to speak aloud. I did make parenting my whole identity, especially after she died. David was all I had left. "But he's not yours to have anymore," Jack pointed out. He's his own man, with his own marriage, his own life to build. And part of being a good father now means respecting that. Even when you disagree with his choices, even when you can see pitfalls he can't. The third revelation came in the form of an email from Emma in early November, breaking the silence with a brief but significant update. We've given notice on the apartment, found a place in Riverdale that's smaller, but within our actual budget, moving December 1st. The message continued with practical details, the new address, a request to forward any mail that might still come to them at the old place, but contained no invitation to help with the move, no request for advice or assistance, no indication that my input would be welcome in this significant life change. Reading between the lines, I understood the deeper message. They were taking control of their financial situation, making responsible choices based on their actual resources rather than the artificial cushion I had provided. They were doing exactly what mature, capable adults should do when faced with financial realities, adapting, adjusting, problem-solving together. And they were doing it without me. The pain of this exclusion was sharp, but clarifying. For perhaps the first time, I saw with absolute clarity the fundamental flaw in my approach to father-son relationships in adulthood. I had been trying to remain central in a life where I was now meant to be peripheral. I had been struggling to maintain the dynamics of David's childhood, my guidance, his dependence, my authority, his compliance. Long after those dynamics should have evolved into something more balanced, more mutual, more respectful of his maturity. These realizations didn't make the silence easy to bear, but they did begin to shift my perspective on what might come next. Not a return to the relationship we had before, but perhaps a construction of something new, something healthier for us both. Thanksgiving approached, traditionally a time when David and Emma would have come for dinner. This year, no invitation was extended, and none was expected. I made vague plans to accept Jack's offer to join his family gathering, then canceled the day before, unable to face the well-meaning questions about David's absence, the pitying looks when I had no satisfactory explanation to offer. Instead, I spent the holiday alone, cooking a small turkey breast more out of habit than hunger, watching football games I had no interest in, trying not to check my phone every few minutes for messages that didn't come. At 8:47 that evening, when I had resigned myself to ending the day without any contact, my phone chimed with a text notification. David's name appeared on the screen, sending my heart rate spiking with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The message was brief, formal. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving. We're settled on the moving plans. Want to let you know we'd appreciate your help on moving day if you're available. December 1st, starting 9 a.m. No need to reply now. Just let us know closer to the date. I stared at the text until the screen dimmed, then lit it again to reread the message, searching for hidden meanings, for clues about where we stood. The language was careful, stripped of emotion, but the invitation itself spoke volumes. A small opening, a tentative step toward reconnection, a willingness to allow me back into their lives in a defined, limited capacity. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't return to our previous closeness, but it was something, a beginning, perhaps. I waited until the next morning to respond, not wanting to appear too eager, too desperate for this small olive branch. Thank you for thinking of me. I'll be there. Just let me know what you need. The reply came hours later. Thumbs up. A single thumbs up emoji, non-committal, minimal, but communication nonetheless. I would take it. The days leading up to December 1st were filled with an anxious energy I hadn't experienced since David's wedding. I tuned up my truck, ensuring it was in perfect condition for hauling whatever they needed moved. I purchased new work gloves, heavy-duty packing tape, bubble wrap. I researched the most efficient moving techniques, as if expertise might somehow compensate for the trust one had lost. The morning of the move dawned cold and clear, a perfect early winter day. I arrived at their apartment 15 minutes early, thermos of coffee in hand, prepared to follow their lead, to help without overstepping, to be useful without being intrusive. A delicate balance I had never before needed to calculate so carefully in my relationship with my son. Emma answered the door, her smile small but genuine. Robert, thank you for coming. We're just finishing up some last-minute packing in the bedroom. The apartment was transformed from the cozy home I remembered into the impersonal chaos of moving day, boxes stacked against walls, furniture disassembled, the accumulated detritus of daily life sorted into piles of keep, donate, and trash. David emerged from the bedroom, nodding in greeting, but skipping our usual hug. Dad, good timing. The rental truck will be here in 20 minutes. Can you help me with the bookshelves? For the next several hours, we worked together in a choreographed routine of lifting, carrying, loading, and securing. The physical labor provided a welcome buffer, allowing us to interact without the weight of direct conversation about what had happened between us. Instead, we communicated in the shorthand of task-oriented necessity. Lift from your end. Watch the doorframe. This goes in the truck last. By mid-afternoon, the old apartment was empty, its walls bare of the photographs and art that had made it their home. As David did a final walkthrough, Emma approached me where I stood by the truck, fidgeting with the straps securing a dresser. "Thank you for today," she said quietly, "and for respecting our need for space these past weeks." I nodded, unsure how much to say, how vulnerable to be in this tentative moment of reconnection. I've had a lot of time to think about everything, about the mistakes I made. She studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Robert, when I first met you at David's graduation, I was so impressed by your relationship, the way he looked up to you, valued your opinion. I thought, I want our children to have that kind of connection with their father someday." The past tense, thought, not think, wasn't lost on me. And now I understand that healthy relationships have boundaries, especially between parents and adult children. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture I recognized from years of family gatherings. "We're still figuring out what those boundaries should look like with you. I'll respect whatever you decide. I promised. However you want me in your lives, or not in your lives, that's what I'll do." She smiled slightly. "I don't think it's about what we decide or what you decide anymore. It's about what we negotiate together, as three adults who care about each other but have separate lives and different needs." The wisdom in her perspective struck me forcefully. This wasn't a binary situation where I was either involved in their lives my way or excluded entirely. It was about finding a middle ground, a new dynamic that honored their independence while still allowing for meaningful connection. David rejoined us then, handing over the keys to the property manager who had arrived for the final inspection. "Ready to head to the new place?" he asked. The question directed at both of us, but his eyes meeting mine with a question that went deeper than the practical matter at hand. "Lead the way," I said simply. "I'll follow you." The new apartment was indeed smaller, a one-bedroom in an older building with none of the modern amenities of their previous place, but with character in its hardwood floors and large windows. More importantly, as David later explained while we assembled their bed frame, the rent was genuinely within their means. "We had to make some trade-offs," he acknowledged, tightening a bolt with more force than strictly necessary. "Longer commute for Emma, less space overall, but it's what we can actually afford." I nodded, careful to offer neither approval nor disapproval, simply acceptance of their decision. "It has a lot of natural light." I observed neutrally. "Good kitchen layout, too." We worked in silence for a few minutes before David spoke again, his voice deliberately casual. "We've been meeting with a financial advisor, setting up a realistic budget, planning for the future based on our actual income." "That's smart," I said, matching his tone, understanding this as both information and a message. They were taking responsibility, making adult decisions, addressing the very concerns I tried to manage for them in all the wrong ways. "Yeah, well, turns out when you suddenly have to pay more than double what you thought your rent was, you need some professional guidance." The edge in his voice was unmistakable, a reminder that while he might be allowing me back into his life in a limited capacity, the hurt and breach of trust remained unresolved between us. I set down my screwdriver, deciding that the artificial normality of our interaction needed to be broken if we were ever to move forward. "David, I know today isn't the time for a deep conversation about what happened, but I want you to know that I've spent these weeks really thinking about why I did what I did, about the kind of father I've been, and the kind I want to be going forward." He looked up, his expression guarded but not closed. And I realize now that I've struggled to adapt as our relationship changed, that I've been trying to stay central in your life when my role should have been evolving into something more peripheral, more supportive without being directive. I swallowed hard, pushing through the discomfort of such naked honesty. I think I was afraid of becoming irrelevant to you, and in trying to prevent that, I ended up betraying your trust in the worst possible way. David was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on a half-assembled bed frame. When he finally spoke, his voice held a complexity of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. You know what the hardest part was? Not the deception itself, though that was bad enough. It was realizing that you didn't see us, me and Emma, as capable adults. That after everything I've worked for, everything I've achieved, you still saw someone who needed to be rescued from his own decisions. The assessment was painfully accurate. You're right. I didn't give you credit for being able to handle challenges on your own terms. I saw the struggle, but not the growth that comes from working through it. We would have figured it out, he said firmly. Maybe moved sooner, maybe made different choices. But we would have figured it out together, as a couple. That's what marriage is. Facing things as a team, not depending on secret bailouts from well-meaning parents. I nodded, accepting the rebuke without defensiveness. I understand that now. Too late, but I do understand. Emma called from the kitchen then, asking for help with the refrigerator placement, breaking the moment of fragile connection. As we moved through the remainder of the day, finishing the essential setup of their new home, I was careful to follow their lead, to offer help without imposing, to respect the new boundaries being established in real time through our interactions. When I finally prepared to leave around 8 that evening, exhausted but oddly hopeful, David walked me to my truck. The night air was cold, our breath forming small clouds between us as we stood awkwardly on the sidewalk. Thanks for your help today, he said formally, as if speaking to an acquaintance rather than his father. We couldn't have managed all that heavy furniture without you. Happy to help, I replied, equally formal, respecting the distance he was maintaining. If you need anything else as you settle in, we'll figure it out, he said quickly, the phrase clearly significant to him. Then, after a pause, but maybe Sunday dinner? In a couple of weeks, once we're settled. Nothing fancy. The invitation, tentative as it was, felt like a gift I hardly deserved. I'd like that, I said simply, restraining the urge to push for more, to pin down details, to try to secure my place in his life through over-planning. I'll text you, he promised, then, in a gesture that caught me completely by surprise, extended his hand for a handshake. Not a hug, not the easy physical affection we had always shared, but a handshake, the greeting of equals, of adults acknowledging each other across a necessary distance. I took his offered hand, understanding the significance of this redefined physical boundary, this small but important signal of our changing relationship. Good night, Dad, he said, releasing my hand and stepping back toward his new home, his wife, his independent life. Good night, son, I replied, climbing into my truck with a strange mixture of loss and hope swirling in my chest. As I drove away, I realized that the day had been a master class in the complex boundaries of adult relationships, what to say and what to leave unspoken, when to offer help and when to step back, how to be present without being intrusive. Lessons I should have learned years ago, but was only now beginning to understand. The relationship we were tentatively rebuilding would never be the one we had before my deception was revealed. It would never again include the unquestioning trust, the easy intimacy, the central role in his life that I had tried so desperately to maintain. But perhaps it could be something else, something more honest, more balanced, more respectful of the adults we both were now. A relationship with healthy boundaries, negotiated together rather than imposed by either of us. A connection based on mutual respect rather than dependency or control. A father-son bond that could evolve and strengthen through the remaining decade of our lives. If only I could continue to learn, to adapt, to recognize that loving my son now meant something very different than it had when he was a child and needed my protection and guidance. As I pulled into my driveway that night, I felt a curious sense of peace despite the uncertainty that still lay ahead. The boundaries between us were being redrawn, the terms of our relationship renegotiated through painful but necessary honesty. And while I mourned what was lost, I found myself cautiously optimistic about what might be built in its place. A relationship between equals, between men who chose to be in each other's lives not out of obligation or dependency, but out of genuine love and respect. The Sunday dinner invitation materialized 2 weeks later, as promised. A text message from David with the simple details. Dinner at our place this Sunday. 6 p.m., nothing fancy. No mention of our strained relationship. No reference to the painful revelations of the past months. Just a straightforward invitation that seemed both ordinary and momentous in its significance. I spent the intervening days oscillating between anticipation and anxiety. What gift should I bring? Wine seemed too casual given the circumstances, while anything substantial might appear as an attempt to reassert the financial support they had explicitly rejected. What topics were safe to discuss? How much interest could I show in their lives without crossing newly established boundaries? In the end, I settled on a modest peace offering, a small potted herb garden for their kitchen windowsill. Practical, inexpensive, symbolic of new growth, it seemed an appropriate contribution to this tentative reconciliation. When Emma opened the door that Sunday evening, the familiar scent of David's spaghetti bolognese, his specialty since college, wafted into the hallway, triggering memories of happier family meals. She accepted the herb garden with genuine pleasure, placing it immediately on the windowsill above their sink. Perfect, she declared. I was just saying we needed to start some herbs in here. The new apartment, now fully unpacked and arranged, had a warmth the previous place had never achieved despite its modern amenities. Bookshelves lined one wall, photographs and art thoughtfully placed to create a sense of home that transcended the modest square footage. A small desk in the corner held Emma's laptop and teaching materials, while David's architectural sketches were pinned to a corkboard above a compact drafting table. They had made this place entirely their own, not through expensive furnishings or trendy decor, but through the purposeful arrangement of possessions that reflected their shared values, interests, and priorities. It struck me forcefully that this apartment, modest though it was, represented something their previous home never had. Authentic independence, genuine self-sufficiency, choices made with clear-eyed understanding of their means and priorities. David emerged from the kitchen, wooden spoon in hand, greeting me with a nod that was neither warm nor cold, cautious, perhaps, but not unwelcoming. Dinner's almost ready. Hope you're hungry. The meal itself was delicious. The conversation carefully navigated around neutral topics. A colleague's retirement at my engineering firm, Emma's challenging but rewarding new classroom of fifth graders, a documentary series David had been watching on urban planning innovations. We spoke as adults sharing information about our separate lives, not as father and son bound by the easy intimacy we had once taken for granted. It wasn't until Emma excused herself after dinner to grade papers, leaving David and me alone at the table with our coffee, that the careful facade of normality slipped, allowing space for more substantive conversation. I've been thinking about what you said on moving day. David began abruptly, his finger tracing the rim of his coffee mug, about struggling to adapt as our relationship changed. I nodded, setting down my own mug to give him my full attention. I meant it. I've had a lot of time to reflect on why I did what I did. I've been trying to understand it too, he admitted, surprising me with this acknowledgement of his own process. Trying to see it from your perspective, and I think maybe I didn't make the transition easy for you either. This was unexpected. An olive branch extended from his side, an admission that the dysfunction in our relationship hadn't been entirely one-sided. What do you mean? I asked carefully, not wanting to presume. David sighed, leaning back in his chair. After Mom died, you and I became a team. We figured everything out together. College applications, my first apartment, career decisions, everything. I relied on you for advice about pretty much every aspect of my life. I nodded, remembering those years with a bittersweet clarity. The grief of Catherine's loss creating a bond between us that had felt unbreakable, the satisfaction of guiding my son through critical life transitions, the sense of purpose that had sustained me through my own mourning. Then I met Emma, and suddenly there was someone else in that inner circle. Another person I turned to for advice, for support. He glanced toward the bedroom where his wife was working, a small smile softening his expression. And I don't think I handled that transition very well. I didn't make clear boundaries about when I wanted your input and when I needed to figure things out with Emma as a couple. The insight was startling in its accuracy. David had indeed sent mixed signals in the early years of his marriage, sometimes soliciting my advice about financial matters or career decisions, other times bristling when I offered the same guidance unasked. I had interpreted this inconsistency as evidence that he still needed my direction, but was reluctant to admit it, rather than recognizing it as the natural growing pains of a young adult trying to balance respect for a parent with commitment to a spouse. "I think you're right," I acknowledged. "There were times when you seemed to want my help, and times when the same kind of help felt like interference. It was confusing." "For me, too," he admitted ruefully. "I was trying to establish our marriage as the primary relationship in my life while still honoring our father-son bond. And instead of having an honest conversation about it, I just reacted, got defensive sometimes, sent mixed messages, expected you to somehow intuitively know when your input was welcome and when it wasn't. The honesty of this self-assessment moved me deeply. It suggested not just a willingness to repair our relationship, but a genuine desire to understand the dynamics that had led to its fracturing, a level of emotional maturity that, I realized with sudden clarity, I had failed to recognize or respect in my son. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly, "but it doesn't excuse what I did. There's a world of difference between offering unwanted advice and secretly paying your rent behind your back." "No, it doesn't excuse it," David agreed, his tone direct but not unkind. "What you did violated our trust in a fundamental way, made us question everything about our financial situation, our decision-making, even our perception of reality for the past 2 years." I winced at this blunt assessment, but didn't dispute it. "I know, and I'm truly sorry." "I believe you are." He met my eyes directly for what felt like the first time in months. "But here's what I've been thinking about lately. If we're going to rebuild any kind of relationship, which I want to do, Dad, we need to understand what happened. Not just what you did, but why you did it, why I reacted the way I did, how we got to this point. The maturity in this approach, seeking understanding rather than simply assigning blame, caught me off guard. When had my son developed this capacity for nuanced self-reflection? Had it always been there, obscured by my perception of him, as someone still in need of my guidance rather than an adult capable of complex emotional insight? "I want that too," I said simply. "To understand, to rebuild." David nodded, then asked a question that cut to the heart of what had happened between us. "Why didn't you just offer to help directly? Why the secrecy?" It was a question I had been asking myself for months, the one I had circled in countless hours of solitary reflection. The honest answer still felt raw, vulnerable, but I owed him nothing less than complete truth. Because I was afraid you'd say no, I admitted. And saying no wouldn't just have meant rejecting financial help. It would have meant rejecting me, my role in your life, the part of my identity that's been defined by being your father, your provider, your protector. The words hung between us, exposing a fear so fundamental I had barely acknowledged it even to myself until this moment. "After your mother died, being your father became the center of my existence," I continued, the words coming easier now that I had started. "My whole sense of purpose, of value, was wrapped up in being needed by you. And when you married Emma, started building your own life, I felt that purpose slipping away. The secret payments were my way of staying necessary to you, even if you didn't know it." David was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. "That's a lot to put on a relationship, Dad. More than any relationship can really bear." "I know that now," I said, the realization having crystallized during our months of separation. "It wasn't fair to you, and ultimately, it wasn't healthy for me either." "So, what now?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than just our immediate situation. Where do we go from here? It was a question I had been both dreading and longing to address. The future of our relationship hung on how we answered it, whether we could find a new foundation for our connection, one built on honesty, mutual respect, and appropriate boundaries. "I think I need to build a life that isn't centered entirely around being your father," I said slowly, the words difficult but necessary. "Find purpose and meaning beyond that role. And you need space to be an adult, to make your own choices, good or bad, without my interference." "But that doesn't mean we can't be close," David added, a note of uncertainty in his voice that reminded me suddenly, painfully, of the little boy who had once looked to me for reassurance. Just clothes in a different way. A healthier way, I agreed, one where I respect your independence and your marriage, where I offer advice only when asked, help only when invited, where we relate as adults who choose to be in each other's lives, not out of obligation or dependency, but because we genuinely value the connection. Something shifted in David's expression then, a softening, a cautious openness. "I'd like to try that," he said. "I just don't know exactly what it looks like in practice." "Neither do I admitted with a small smile. "I guess we figure it out as we go. Make mistakes, correct course, be honest with each other when boundaries are crossed." "That sounds reasonable," he said, the ghost of an answering smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Honest, at least. And that's what was missing before." Emma rejoined us then, her grading completed, settling into the chair beside David with a questioning glance between us, clearly sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Everything okay?" she asked cautiously. "Getting there," David replied, reaching for her hand. "Dad and I were just discussing what our relationship might look like going forward, how to rebuild on better terms." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that too, actually, about how families evolve, how roles change over time." "And," I prompted gently, genuinely interested in her perspective. "And I think healthy family relationships have to be renegotiated as people grow and change," she said, her teacher's gift for clear explanation evident. What works when someone is 20 doesn't necessarily work when they're 30 or 40. The challenge is figuring out how to maintain meaningful connection while allowing for that evolution. Her insight struck me as profound in its simplicity. All families face this challenge. The renegotiation of relationships as children became adults, as parents aged, as new members joined through marriage or birth. The dynamics that functioned well in one life stage became inappropriate, even harmful, if carried unchanged into the next. I never really thought about it that way. I admitted, I just kept trying to be the same kind of father I'd always been, even when that wasn't what David needed anymore. "What would help you?" David asked suddenly, the question directed at me with genuine curiosity. "To make this transition, to find meaning beyond being my father." The question caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't thought about it during our months apart, but because I hadn't expected my son to concern himself with my emotional needs in the midst of his own justified hurt and anger. The consideration inherent in the question was itself a sign of how our relationship was shifting, becoming more reciprocal, more balanced. "I've been thinking about volunteering," I said, sharing an idea that had been forming gradually. "There's a program that teaches basic construction and home repair skills to disadvantaged youth. They need people with experience to serve as mentors." "That sounds perfect for you," Emma said warmly. "You've always been good at explaining practical skills, and it would be a way to channel that desire to guide and teach in a context where it's explicitly wanted and needed." The gentle observation that my need to provide guidance could find appropriate expression outside my relationship with my son landed with surprising force. She had identified precisely what I had been struggling to articulate to myself, that the paternal instincts that had become problematic in my relationship with David weren't inherently wrong, just misdirected. "I think you'd be really good at that," David added, and the simple vote of confidence from my son meant more than he could possibly know. The conversation flowed more easily after that, moving into practical aspects of our evolving relationship, how often we might see each other, what kinds of support would be welcome, how to communicate more openly about expectations and boundaries. There were no dramatic revelations or emotional declarations, just a steady, intentional work of three adults trying to build something new from the damaged foundation of what had come before. As the evening drew to a close, I helped clear the dinner dishes, careful not to take over the task or offer unsolicited advice about their kitchen organization. As I prepared to leave, David walked me to the door, Emma hanging back to give us a moment of privacy. "This was good," he said simply. "A start." "Yes," I agreed. "A good start." He hesitated, then added, "I'm not ready to completely let go of what happened. The trust that was broken, that takes time to rebuild." "I understand," I said, and I did. Trust was earned through consistent behavior over time, not granted based on a single conversation, however honest. I'm willing to put in that time, David, for however long it takes. He nodded, then surprised me by initiating a brief hug. Not the easy, unthinking embrace we had once shared, but a deliberate gesture of cautious reconnection. "Good night, Dad," he said, stepping back. "Drive safely." As I walked to my car, the night air crisp with the promise of approaching winter, I felt a curious mixture of emotions. Sadness for what had been lost in my own actions, but also hope for what might still be built in its place. The relationship we were tentatively reconstructing would be different from what had come before, more conscious, more balanced, more honest in its acknowledgement of both connection and separation. The drive home took me past the neighborhood where David and Emma had lived in their previous apartment, the one I had secretly subsidized for so long. The familiar streets now held a different meaning, a reminder of the damage that could be done by good intentions divorced from respect for others' autonomy. I made a deliberate choice to take a different route home, symbolically leaving behind the patterns that had led to our estrangement. In the following months, our relationship continued its careful reconstruction. Sunday dinners became a monthly tradition, supplemented by occasional texts and calls that respected appropriate boundaries. I joined the mentoring program, finding unexpected fulfillment in guiding young people who genuinely wanted and needed the expertise I could offer. David and Emma settled into their new apartment, making it increasingly their own as they adjusted to a budget based on financial reality rather than hidden support. The first major test of our new dynamic came in April, when David called one evening with news that would once have triggered all my protective instincts. "Emma's been offered a position at a school in Baltimore," he said, without preamble. "Better salary, opportunity to develop curriculum for gifted students. We're seriously considering it. Baltimore, nearly 3 hours away, far enough to make casual visits impossible, to transform our newly established Sunday dinners from monthly occurrences to occasional events requiring significant planning. The old me would have immediately launched into all the reasons this was a poor decision, the challenges of a long-distance move, the cost of living in an unfamiliar city, the career implications for David, the distance from family support. I would have offered financial assistance to make staying locally more appealing, suggested alternatives that would keep them within my orbit, perhaps even contacted connections in the local school district to find Emma comparable opportunities here. Instead, I took a deep breath and asked, "How do you feel about the possibility?" "Mixed," he admitted. "Excited for Emma. It's a great opportunity. Nervous about finding a new position for myself. Sad about leaving friends and family, but also kind of energized by the idea of a fresh start somewhere new." "It sounds like you're thinking it through carefully," I said, carefully keeping my tone neutral despite the knot forming in my stomach at the thought of them moving so far away. "What can I do to support you through the decision-making process?" The brief silence on the other end of the line suggested my response had surprised him. Perhaps he had been bracing for resistance, for attempts to dissuade them from considering the move. "Actually," he said finally, "we could use some help researching neighborhoods there. Safe areas with reasonable commutes to Emma's potential school, if you wouldn't mind." "I'd be happy to," I replied, meaning it despite the pain of potentially facilitating their move away from me. "I'll send you what I find, no commentary attached. Just information you can use to make your decision." "Thanks, Dad," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "That would be really helpful." After we hung up, I sat for a long time in my quiet house, processing the emotions this conversation had stirred. Grief at the prospect of seeing even less of my son and daughter-in-law. Fear that our fragile reconciliation might not survive the distance. Anxiety about aging alone, without family nearby for support or companionship. But beneath these natural concerns ran a current of something else, a quiet pride in my own response, in my ability to prioritize their needs and autonomy over my desire to keep them close. A recognition that true love for my adult son meant supporting his choices, even when those choices took him away from me. A growing confidence that our relationship, if built on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect, could withstand the challenge of geographic separation. In the end, David and Emma did accept the Baltimore position, moving in June with a promise to return for major holidays, and a standing invitation for me to visit whenever I wished. I help with the move, careful to offer practical assistance without attempting to influence their decisions about their new home, their budget, their life in a new city. The day I drove back alone after helping them settle in, my truck empty of belongings I had helped transport, I felt a profound sense of both loss and accomplishment. I had let go, truly let go, of my need to direct my son's life, to remain at its center, to secure my relevance through control or financial support. In doing so, I had opened the possibility for a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than dependency or obligation. 3 months after their move, as fall painted the trees along I-95 in brilliant reds and golds, I made the drive to Baltimore for my first visit to their new home. The apartment they had chosen was larger than their previous place, with a second bedroom they were setting up as a guest room. For me, David mentioned casually, as well as for other visitors. Over dinner at a local restaurant they were eager to introduce me to, David shared news that once would have triggered all my protective, controlling impulses. We're thinking about starting a family next year. Starting to save for a down payment on a house, too. Smaller steps than we might have taken before, but ones we know are within our actual means. That's wonderful, I said sincerely, genuinely happy for them without feeling any need to offer unsolicited advice or financial assistance. You'll be wonderful parents. Later that evening, as we walked back to their apartment through streets they were clearly coming to know and love, David said something that confirmed we had indeed found a new foundation for our relationship. You know what I've realized, Dad? I actually value your advice more now that I know you'll only give it when I ask for it. Knowing you respect our decisions makes me more interested in hearing your perspective, not less. The irony wasn't lost on me, that in surrendering my desperate grip on relevance in my son's life, I had actually created space for a more genuine, more equal connection, that by acknowledging his full adulthood and autonomy, I had earned a different kind of trust than the one I had broken through my deception. I've realized something, too, I replied as we walked side by side to the cooling evening. Being your father will always be the most important role I've ever had, but it can't be my only identity, my only source of purpose. That's too much weight for any relationship to bear. David nodded, understanding the journey I had been on during these months of separation and gradual reconciliation. And it's not a fixed role anyway. It keeps changing as we both change. Exactly, I agreed. The father you needed at 10 isn't the father you need at 32. And that's as it should be. As we reached their apartment building, David paused, turned to face me directly. I'm glad we found our way back to each other, Dad. Even if it took everything that happened to get us here. So am I said simply, the words inadequate to express the depth of my gratitude for the second chance, this new beginning built on painful but necessary honesty. Later that night, lying awake in their newly prepared guest room, I reflected on the strange, difficult, ultimately healing journey we had traveled over the past year. From my well-intentioned but destructive secret support, through the painful confrontation and revelation, the careful navigation of new boundaries, to this new foundation for our family bonds, one based not on dependency or control, but on mutual respect, honest communication, and the recognition that love between parents and adult children must evolve to remain healthy. I had lost the illusion that I could protect my son from all of life's hardships. I had surrendered the comforting belief that I would always be central to his existence, necessary to his well-being. I had given up the role of provider, protector, director of his life's course. But in exchange, I had gained something precious, an authentic relationship with the man my son had become, a connection based on choice rather than obligation, on respect rather than control, on honesty rather than comforting fictions. A bond that could evolve and strengthen to the remaining years of our lives, adapting to each new life stage with conscious intention rather than unconscious resistance. It wasn't what I had imagined our relationship would be when I had secretly paid their rent all those months ago. It was something harder to achieve, requiring more self-awareness and continual effort to maintain. But it was also something more genuine, more equal, more sustaining for us both. As I finally drifted towards sleep in a room my son and daughter-in-law had prepared specifically for my visits, a tangible sign of my welcome, limited but genuine, in their independent lives, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The peace of having found my proper place in my son's adult life. Not at its center directing the action, but at its periphery, a loving presence, available when needed, respectful of boundaries when not. The peace, ultimately, of loving my son enough to let him go, and finding that in releasing my grip, I had not lost him at all, but gained the opportunity for a relationship that could grow and deepen to all the chapters of our lives still to come.